Hey everybody, it's Captain Shane and I'm back with a new video series I'm going to be starting on the MD-11. I had a poll up on my YouTube channel and the majority of people wanted to know more about the systems, the advanced systems of the MD-11. So in this series I'm going to cover those, but today, before we go into super advanced stuff, I want to go over the overhead panel and give you a brief introduction to what all of these things are, and in subsequent videos we'll go into more detail. For example, it'll be a brief overview today, but another video will go over just the hydraulic system. Then one video will go over the electrical panel. Another video will go over the air panel, so on and so forth until we get through all of this stuff. And then maybe we'll start moving down to other stuff in the cockpit until we get basically everything discussed. So one thing to keep in mind is this video is being made on X-Plane 12 on the Rotate MD-11. However, you can use this video on more or less any professionally done MD-11 flight simulator. So this should work for the TFDi MD-11, Rotate MD-11, probably even the PMDG MD-11 from the good old days, because most of these guys are doing high quality stuff and the systems are modeled more or less correctly and identically. So you should be able to take this information and use it anywhere. So with that being said, let's go into a brief overview of the overhead panel today, and we'll start from top left and go to the bottom right. I would say the most important button on this entire panel that you need to know is the annunciator light test, and it's right here. Here, tell you what, I'll circle it for you. Right over here. And that button will test every single light, digit, and flow line that you got in the entire cockpit, especially here. Let's press it. Also gives you the overspeed warning. And if you hold it for 12 seconds, it also runs the air system test, but that's something we'll talk about in another video. But you should press this button as part of your initial cockpit preparation. I have that in my checklist. It is available if you'd like to see that, the X checklist. So press that button, make sure all the lights come on, make sure everything's working. And again, you see the air system test is coming on right now. We're not going to talk about that today. One thing to keep in mind on the MD-11 overhead, it is based on a philosophy that it's a lights off overhead, meaning if you don't see a light on a button, that's a good thing. If you see a light on a button, that means something's either wrong, requires pilot attention, or something is in a less than standard configuration, right? You'll see, for example, on the air panel, you have these pressure and off lights, right? This is telling you that there's something actually wrong with the system. All right, you don't want to see lights up here. If you see lights, something is not correct. You'll see here that these are about to go out. Okay. When these lights go out, it's telling you that the system is back in normal operating configuration and there's no issue. So keep that in mind. If you see lights on the overhead panel with some very specific caveats, which I'll go over when we get to those specific systems, there's something probably wrong. So, top left corner, let me circle it. Over here is the cargo fire panel. This tells you if you have a cargo fire back in the back of the aircraft, right? And here is also the buttons you'll use to discharge a fire agent if you have any left. When you turn on the IRUs for the first time at the beginning of every flight, if they're off, it automatically initiates this cargo fire manual test. You can press it manually yourself. Okay. Next, let's go over to the top center, and these are your T-handles. That's what we call them in the aviation maintenance community. The T-handles, also known as engine firewall shutoff valves. These handles control the fuel and hydraulic supply to each engine. So they don't necessarily shut the engine off except for starving it of fuel and shutting off hydraulic flow. This is for in the event of an engine fire, right? You don't want to be dumping hydraulic fluid, which is flammable at certain temperatures, and engine or jet fuel into an engine that's on fire. So pulling this handle down shuts off those two fluids to the engine, which will essentially shut the engine off because if there's no more fuel going to it. And then from there, you can twist each handle left or right or both, and it will discharge fire agent. We'll go over that more when we get to the fire protection system. Right here is your APU control panel. Also, you have your engine APU fire test here. This is the button that starts and stops it, and this is your APU fire handle in the event of an APU fire. You also have some annunciator lights here. I'll show them to you. Those are the lights you'll see on the APU panel. So it's all controlled from here. Okay, let's go over to the left, next row. This is your IRU panel, IRU, IRS, whatever acronym you want to use. Inertial reference units or inertial reference system. These are what give guidance to your aircraft and allow it to fly through the air and know where it's at. All three of these need to be turned on for flight. You have a 1, 2, and auxiliary. Essentially, you have 3. There's only 2 positions here, off for nav. Okay, this is extremely important. You're not going anywhere without these things on and aligned, and we'll talk about what that means in other videos. Okay, next to that is your hydraulic panel, and this controls all 3 of the independent hydraulic systems and their associated pumps, valves, the test switch. All of that is on this hydraulic panel here. Okay, coming over here, you have your auto flight control system, right? You have your flap limit, your yaw damper stuff. This is a flap override in the event of a abnormal flap configuration. Elevator feel, in the event that you have a malfunction of the automatic system, you can control the elevator feel manually here. We'll talk about that more in another video. Okay, and then here's one. This is one that gets a lot of attention. It's much maligned or loved depending on who you speak to. LSAS stands for Longitudinal Stability Augmentation System. This was a system that McDonnell Douglas put on the MD-11 to try to make it feel more like the old DC-10. The MD-11 has a small, abnormally small, smaller than it should be, horizontal stabilizer, and they did that for drag purposes to try to improve fuel efficiency, but it made the plane very touchy in the pitch axis. So the longitudinal stability augmentation system, and there's one for each elevator essentially, because there's 4 elevators on this jet. Attempts to try to assist the pilot in flying the aircraft and keeping the pitch under control. How well it does that is up for debate. But normally these should be on. You don't want them off unless you have a mechanical or some sort of autopilot failure. We'll talk more about those later on. Okay. Off to the far right side here, you have some overrides, right? You have your ground proximity warning system override for terrain and your flap override switches. We'll talk more about what those are and when you would use those when we get to that video. And then aileron deflect override. This is for the deflected ailerons option on MD-11s. Some have it, some don't, depending on your operator. Basically allows the ailerons to droop a little bit, and that's to improve fuel efficiency and that sort of thing. It's something that McDonnell Douglas added to the aircraft after it was initially produced when it did not meet its initial fuel burn targets. They had to do something to try to improve the aerodynamics of the aircraft, and this is one of the things they came up with. But not everybody uses it because it can be prone to maintenance issues. Okay, let's continue. Moving over to the left again. We have these, this is the cockpit voice recorder here, right? There's a test switch here and an erase function. This is more or less eye candy, guys. I don't think it has any real function in any flight simulator. It's just here because they're trying to be thorough and they want to model everything. It's the CVR microphone and the gain and all that other stuff. Don't worry about it too much. Okay, below the hydraulic panel, you have the electrical panel, and there's a lot going on here. As you can see, there's a lot of different things to do with it. I'll do my best to cover this panel when we get to that video. I will be honest with you, this is probably the subsystem that I understand the least on the MD-11, and I would say that I'm pretty well informed on this, but there's a lot of stuff going on with all these different buses, DC bus, AC buses, AC cross ties, the smoke, the electrical and smoke, electrical and air smoke isolation switch. I will do my very best to explain it to you guys, but I don't claim to be the leading authority on the electrical system on the MD-11. Hydraulics, yes. Electrical, no. But we'll talk about it. Okay, coming over, just below the cockpit voice recorder are these 3 guarded switches here called the Gen Bus Fault Reset. These are typically not to be used in flight. This is something for ground maintenance personnel to clear out hard faults that could not be resolved in the air. So if you look in your flight crew operating manual, it's probably never going to tell you to touch these switches, okay? So keep the guards on them, don't touch them. This is for your maintainers to fix when something breaks. All right, let's see here. A little bit below the Gen Bus Fault Reset buttons is your cargo temperature controller. All right, so you have your forward cargo temp controller, which basically only has 3 positions, right? You have low, high, or off, and then you have the aft, which is, you know, the larger compartment on the aircraft. And that one you can kind of dial it in a little bit more, a little bit less. This is more or less eye candy, guys. You're flying in the flight deck. I don't think you need to be too worried about the cargo compartments too much. But, you know, if you want to watch the temperatures go up and down on your air synoptic, be my guest. Okay. Continuing on here, this is the air panel. Oh, right here. This is the air panel here, and this controls the bleed air system and the air conditioning system on the aircraft, right? So you have 3 packs on the aircraft. The pack is basically air conditioning system, and it's what creates the pressure on the aircraft. And you can adjust the cockpit, the crew rest area, or the cargo compartment, part of the cargo compartment temperature with these dials here. These are your packs, 1, 2, and 3. Typically they're always on, but you can turn one off if you need to for troubleshooting or a maintenance failure. These are wing isolation valves for bleed air, APU bleed, and the manifold fails, and your pressure monitoring over here for each bleed air system. Bleed air is provided from 4 sources on the aircraft, each engine and the APU. And you would need to turn the bleeds on, or, well, they're on by default for the engine, but the APU bleed is manually turned on and off by the pilot. Okay. You also have some additional switches here that we'll talk about later on, to include the emergency mask drop button, which that's why it's got a red guard on there, because you don't really want to mess with that unless it's really necessary. Okay, continuing off to the right. Hey, we're almost done, guys, I swear. I know it's meant to be short, but there's a lot to discuss. This is your cabin pressure control panel. You have, this is typically an automatic, okay? So the system is an automatic normally, but if you have a failure of the automatic pressure controller, you would have to control some of these things yourself, i.e. the landing altitude here, or the outflow valve. You can open and close the outflow valve based on your need, and you would use this here, this schedule, to determine what cabin altitude to set the cabin at based on the altitude you're flying at. Okay. We'll talk more about that when we get to cabin pressure stuff, and I'll probably include that with the air panel, because they're kind of related, because the cabin pressure comes from here. Okay, directly below the cabin pressure is your anti-ice panel. You have engine anti-ice, wing and tail anti-ice as well. Below that, you have your windshield anti-ice. So these switches operate a little bit differently than the rest, right? Okay, remember how I told you no lights are good? Well, the same is true for anti-ice, because the default position of your anti-ice should be off, right? So you don't want a light that says it's off on this anti-ice in the windshield, because they should be off by default. You'll get a light that comes on if you turn them on, because that's not the normal situation, okay? So that's just something to keep in mind. If you see these switches on, it's not standard configuration. The only button that you want to see no light on is the defog button. And why is that? Well, we want our windshield defog on all the time whenever we're in the aircraft and we're operating it, because we don't want it to fog up for any reason. Fogging is different than windshield ice, okay? So by default, we actually want the defog on, so that's why the light is out. If the defog is off, you see a light there because that's not a normal condition, right? Just trying to help you guys understand how all of this stuff works. as far as why a light should be on or off. But again, we'll go over that more in detail. Okay, let's come over here. This is the engine ignition and the FADEC control panel. So FADEC stands for Full Authority Digital Engine Control. Okay, so this is the digital engine control for each engine. This is standard, should be guard closed with the light out. Okay, now if you have some sort of failure, you can go into FADEC alternate, but you should only be messing with that if the aircraft tells you to do it or your flight crew operating manual tells you to do that. Engine ignition switches are here. You have a channel A, a channel B, a channel A and B, and you have an override. Typically, we would only use channel A or channel B, and we alternate between flights, right? Because these are basically igniters, and we don't need to be burning up our igniters all the time, having both systems on. Well, let me rephrase that. The igniters are automatically controlled by the aircraft. Turning on this button does not necessarily turn on the igniters. It just arms it to be turned on by the automatic control system when they need to be on. And there's two different channels in case there's a failure. The override is something you'll mess with if the aircraft tells you to do that, or your flight crew operating manual tells you to. Again, we'll go over that more on another video. Okay, fuel panel. This thing is pretty cool, and there's a lot going on behind the hood, if you will. So this system is automatically controlled, and it does a pretty good job of keeping the fuel trimmed up, keeping the tanks level, and in flight, when it's in automatic mode, not manual, it will pump fuel aft to these aux tanks and or these tail tanks, for the tail tank, which is in a horizontal stabilizer, to keep the CG as aft as possible. Because the MD-11 flies best with an aft CG. It burns less fuel when you have aft CG. So the automatic fuel controller will pump fuel around to maintain a CG in the low 30 percentile. And there's nothing you can do to control that unless you manually take control and pump it forward. Okay, you cannot pump fuel after yourself. Only the automatic system can, because it's very, very easy for you to accidentally pump way too much fuel aft, for example, and get the aircraft so out of trim that it's unflyable. So it won't let you mess with the CG by moving it aft. It will only let you move it forward. Again, I shouldn't be talking about all this. That's for the fuel system video. Okay. Right over here is some important buttons that you need to know. This is a cargo door test. Typically, this is done automatically after engine start. You have the annunciator bright and dim buttons, which basically makes all these things bright or not. See how bright that is? Now watch when I go dim. A lot more dim, right? That's good for low light conditions, right? So let's say we have all the lights off. You typically are going to want that stuff in dim. Because if you have it in bright, it's going to blow you out. But you can control it that way. Also have the fuel used reset. Let me show you how that works. So let's go here. Let's go down to here. I'm going to pull up the fuel synoptic right there. Now you'll notice that the fuel being used is indicated on each engine here. Now if you want to reset that value so you can get a read of how much fuel you burn, you'll press the fuel use reset and watch what happens to these little engines. Okay, well, or it'll make a liar out of me and it won't do it. So I'll have to figure out why that button's not working. What it should do is reset the fuel used right here. But for whatever reason, that's not working. I'll investigate and get back to you with the better answer later on. And you have the engine pointer max reset. So let me show you how that works. So let's say something happens where you get out of control and you accidentally overboost an engine. So here's an example. Look at that. I was way exceeded the N2 on engine number 2, and we have a pointer that basically says, hey, you've exceeded a limit here, and that's going to remain until you do something about it. So what can you do about it? You can hit this engine max pointer reset, and you'll notice that it now cleared that fault off there. Now it's not going to clear it off the digital flight data recorder. So maintenance is going to find out that you were being a naughty boy or girl and getting out of control with your engines, right? So you can't hide it from the man, but you can at least clear it off your EAD. right? There you go. Remember, that's not a get out of jail free button. Okay, just about done here, guys. The last panel we need to talk about is your the windshield wiper controls. And you got this little button, which is fuel dump, emergency stop. We're going to talk about that when we go over the fuel panel. And then you have your light control panel. Remember I was telling you about normal operation would be lights off? A couple exceptions to this, and again, it's kind of weird, right? The logo light always has a light on there. I don't know why particularly this one does, but that's always going to say something. So that's a very minor difference with the rest of these lights coming on. The rest of these are going to basically be on when it's not normal configuration, right? So in flight, you're always going to have these lights on, nav light, beacon, and high intensity. Runway turnoff lights are only on under certain conditions, so you would have a light on here because you don't always have those on. Anyway, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the lights panel. Ooh, I've been talking for a long time. This went 21 minutes and I didn't mean for it to, but hopefully you understand what all of these buttons and knobs are now. And in the following days, I'll have follow-up videos going over each of these subsystems in much more detail, and so we can keep these things into bite-sized pieces so we don't have a 2-hour-long video. This one's already longer than I wanted it to be, right? If I were to talk about every one of these subsystems right now, we'd be here for 3 hours, and I don't want to do that to you. So I'm going to end this one here. If you have any questions about the MD-11 overhead, please post a comment or come to my Discord. The link should be available in the video description. I would love to have a conversation about MD-11s, and if I said something wrong, if I'm incorrect about something, correct me so I can correct myself on subsequent videos, because again, I'm not a real MD-11 pilot, I'm just a sim one. I am an aircraft mechanic in real life, but you know, that doesn't mean I know everything. So if I said something wrong, please tell me. I'm not too proud to admit it. Alright guys, I'll catch you on the next one.